Um, I'm Paula Morantz Cohen. Yay! So this is the of our Pennoni doing these for times, but this one on identity politics should be that bad snowstorm last winter, so we're doing it again on popular demand. But I want to thank the people in my college in putting this, the directorship of in the back. And Torek, where's Brian? There he is. We're all involved in making this happen. That you might be interested in, once a month we are having another similar sort of event. Our next one will be Wednesday, November 13th, and the topic will be city. You can just walk down and you will see a building, if you haven't been in there, that is absolutely mind-blowing. The climb painstakingly refurbished. So just if you have any interest in architecture, I recommend that you go there and you check out the many these sessions that we've had there have been very interesting. We try and get people, older people, from Rittenhouse Square and Washington. So, without further ado, I want to get to our panel, and I'll start by introducing our moderator, who will then introduce the panelists. He was founder and director of the Drexel Survey Research Center for 20 years. He's authored numerous articles and books. He's been a PI in several on POTUS XM 124 at 7:20 in the morning. Is that right? And is it the coming Monday or is it the Monday after? Catch Bill. I've known Bill for many years, since he came to Drexel.
Since we were both in 8th grade.
Almost like, it feels like that. Who is moderating this panel? Yeah.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. I should note that to the activities here. I'm also kind of very interested and excited to hear what our panelists have to say about identity politics, and when this go around, I made mention of the fact that this issue is very controversial, okay? And wrong might be. I don't think it's going to be as controversial as it could very well be based upon the panelists that were here. The last go round there was different set of would have been provocateur towards the perspectives that the other people on the panel are. So
You'll have to play that role, Bill.
So Well, I will eagerly play that. Don't mind, but I was a little bit taken by Paula's point about the canceling society or canceling approach. So I'm just going to diverge for just a minute because I am what I would consider a victim of to do with identity politics, bringing it up. So my sort of niece of sorts is a very big staffer. She worked on a Senate office team, now to a house, and now works as a lobbyist. And she loves to be on Twitter and Facebook and very she made a comment last year in 2000 that I kind of felt I won't say, but it was wonderful that a change of with me is hopes. Okay. Well, this identity politics that reared its head she canceled me essentially. And, she says, "Well, that's my daughter," you know, and that's fine. With that is a little bit of Dr. Cohen's I sort of maybe like losing I believe all those ideas, but just so that we can sort of have them she's from the area, from Yeadon, Pennsylvania. She went to Bryn Mawr College. There, and basically she's received various awards for her actions, particularly both state and national politics, particularly in terms of the civil rights community, and basically I'm not sure which.
Previously, it actually was on POTUS, but years and years ago.
Okay.
Years and years ago.
So actually, it really me was. So the one I'm on, which is POTUS, is basically more a discussion of main and some of the stations, it's kind of like either Fox News or MSNBC. It's station popularity. Hopefully not on the right wing, given his biography. teaching then finally, we have to help me here a little bit. I'm sorry. In Wakabaya. Okay. Pronounce it. That promote democratic women interested in public office. This is the for 30 or when virtually there were no women in politics. Okay, that they often were maybe committee women and local and or of women that are engaged in politics. And in fact, in 2008, team was she's also involved in various issues in Pennsylvania, Equality Pennsylvania, which is a statewide. And she would have a junior college in Pennsylvania. What I'd like to do is sort of speak for about 2 minutes on each one of those things, and then we can go off of that, okay? So if we could start, I guess what I would like you to answer, maybe we'll go Lenny in the middle, and then we'll go, so everyone doesn't feel like we're going down the line here. What's your image politics is all about?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, and thanks for having me and having us up here today. Second of all, it seems very odd that you picked me in the middle and put me on the spot right away, but that's okay. I'm just kidding, I promise, I'm just kidding. It all depends really on how you want to look at identity politics. Because if you go back to the founding of this country, it was very much based on identity, right? White, male, own land. You have to own land, you have to have some money. In the 1700s, if you had a decent amount of land, you probably had a slave. So you're already talking about an identity drafting the Constitution in the direction initially of this country. So when people talk about identity politics a lot of times in a negative light, it's when you look back at the founding fathers all the way through. Even if you look at, a lot of times people talk about the 45 presidents. Well, there's one of these kids, like they said on Sesame Street, is doing their own thing. One of these kids is not quite the same. Everybody else was pretty much rich or close to rich, white, male, over a certain age. When I think about identity politics, I think about people coming together and looking out for their best interest and making sure public policy mirrors with that. Now, are there times where identity politics and those best interests can contravene the best interests of others? Absolutely, and that's where the dialogue has to come into play, and ideally, good elected officials can get it right for the most amount of people and the greatest good. But identity politics in and of itself, to me, is not a bad thing. I would suspect that every American citizen would be involved in some sense of identity politics to ensure that their communities have the opportunity to survive as citizens and be able to enjoy their constitutional rights regardless of where they come from.
Okay, great. So, Ann, maybe if you could take that same question and maybe if you could incorporate the notion about pluralism in our idea about competing interests or competing groups, that might be an interesting add-on to Lenny's position.
Sure. Well, I would also start with I hate the phrase identity politics. I almost said no to this panel because it was in the email subject line, and I hate the word identity politics because I think what we do is we use the phrase to describe changing, we use the word to describe the fact that we are starting to confront the fact that our government has looked white and male and straight for a very, very long time. And so what identity politics really is folks that look like everyday people, folks that look like the actual population of the United States getting involved in our government and saying, I have a unique perspective. I bring to this because I don't look like the sort of generic white male, because I like that's not my life experience, because I have experienced giving birth and I know what a good paid family leave policy, why that's important, because I have worked for minimum wage and I know what as a single, head of household, what an increased minimum wage would do for me. That, I've experienced gun violence, so I know why we need to do more to protect our citizens. When you bring that experience, a richer diversity of experience to public policy, which is desperately needed, because right now we've got a bunch of old white guys in Harrisburg and Washington kind of using only their limited experience in the world to make policy, and that hurts everyone that is not them. So I think identity politics is kind of like, we talk about it like, oh man, like you want me to vote for you because you're a woman, or you want me to vote for you because like I'm Asian or I'm gay or whatever. That's not what we're saying. We're saying, because I hold these identities and these experiences, I bring a different perspective to governing that is needed, because there are people like me in the community that I want to serve. And so I kind of want to start by framing it. I think, in terms of pluralism, and then how does that play out in our wider communities, I would say folks that have had experiences where they haven't been the sort of most powerful group, right? They are more likely to understand the ways public policy, the ways structural and systemic racism and sexism and homophobia other people, because they've seen the way it affects their lives, so they can more easily put themselves in other people's shoes and recognize that there are different ways of thinking about things. So I think in all, the thing that we call identity politics is really just folks taking back our government, making it work for us. I don't have a snappier way to define that.
Okay. Lauren, how about you? And since your two panelists didn't respect the 2-minute warning issue, you don't have to either.
Okay, no, I'll try to keep it under 2 minutes. So I definitely agree. I think that when I hear the word the words identity politics, it definitely comes with a negative connotation, as if someone is wrong to talk about their identities, as if they leave all of those identities at the door. Colleagues, that when you've had a government that wasn't created with certain folks in mind, you have to talk about your identity and lived experience, because if you don't, how will we ever shift the narrative and the conversation? I think that people are uncomfortable with the real conversation around, like, what does, not just diversity and representation, but what does real equity look like? And I think we start to get to this conversation of equity when we start talking about identity. And so I think that sometimes, particularly in the media, they try to censor or try to belittle people's experiences and saying, oh, you're just asking for me to vote for you because of you're a black woman, or all of those different things. And so as someone, I live in PA 5, and so Congressional District 5, and so we're one of the most, if not the most diverse congressional district in the state. And so that's definitely a conversation around like, who did we send to Congress? And I think that I'm a type of person, you have to have these conversations, because if we don't have conversations, the needle forward about the fact that we're the most diverse. So what does your campaign staff look like? Who are we actually sending on Congress? What is your political agenda? And again, it may come up as identity politics, but it's just like, who are you actually there to represent? I think that people try to denounce this whole conversation just because it makes folks uncomfortable, and because it has such a negative connotation because of the media. I think at times people just use it as a way to really not engage, and oftentimes women or people are calling in, but I think sometimes the majority does not want to lean in. So it's just easier to just use identity politics as a way to say, oh, you're not qualified, because I think it can at some point become offensive when people use it, because it takes away all of the work, all of the expertise, all of the lived experience. when you just say identity politics, because you're saying they have nothing else to bring to the table besides that. So I think it's a word, I think that we have, or a phrase, I think it's okay when we're using it. We just need to be a little around it, and also recognize that when you're having a conversation about identity politics, that you're not diminishing all the other attributes, and also recognizing that folks are just trying to literally reshape space for us in a society that was created with a lot of us not in mind.
And if I may, I'd like to about the conversation we're having about identity politics, right? The phrase affirmative action. Their program that was supposed to help alleviate ongoing inequalities and disparities. And it was supposed to be empowering and embracing a more perfect union is now as that's unfair, that's unwanted, and if you're an African American, affirmative action was necessary even in 2019, then you're not really a true look at identity politics in one way. Identity politics was basically supposed to be an empowering point to say, community, you rally your folks, you get them to the polls, and you go get a person one way or another that's your interest, and we'll listen to you. You be different like everybody else, and one of the things that we have to be cautious about when we type the things is that to bring us together because of this cannot make us to keep the separations.
Just as a mild because that action was a lot of serious problems with it, and it's a thing that people are antagonistic or affirmative. California, it's what he wasn't because there was is a fear very much. And how does all
back your personal copy? Pretty simple, because it's necessarily treat officers putting the night the same. Since it came into existence, but again, this is something else that we have to understand is every time there's been a move to bring about a sense of equality where minority groups were empowered, there becomes a new twist. For example, the LGBTQ community, when it comes to constitutional right for American farmers, 15-year fight in the courts. One identity politics has to now
maybe if we can just there was a service at my synagogue to sort of talk to comment and expand on it. And the point that I made in my statement is all about identity politics. And you're here because you're Jewish and you feel threatened. Okay? So every group essentially practices identity politics. But I guess where I'm sort of maybe drawing a little bit of a white versus people of color. Okay? It's most groups have a definition about themselves and their identities versus other groups. Okay, and I wonder how that both in terms of, let's say, national identity, people coming from different parts of the world. Okay, the difference between, let's say, someone from Mexico and someone from Poland. Okay, one being. How does that play out in this identity sort of free-for-all that you all experience?
I have answers. I'm just trying to be polite.
I think it's a couple of different things. I think when you talk about identity politics, I think again we talk about like who has the privilege to claim their identity and push for those for the people that are underrepresented in general when they, and I think this goes back to before, that yes, everyone has identity, yes, everyone seeks community, and we all have people that we connect with, but I think when certain groups has for a long time, when they start to come together intersectionally or within their respective issue occurs. And so I think that is where I think the challenge comes. I think that if you seek community, you seek it.
As well as the world, and they all say, you know, I'm how do these pieces, maybe we'll have Ann because okay, but Ann,
You know I drove 350 miles in the rain to get here, so
There you go.
I had a lot of time to prepare.
So Ann, what is your thought about identity politics versus assimilation and acculturation, these kind of perspectives that are often bandied about in the political landscape and have been, you know, for the last 40 or 50 years?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like I have a lot of thoughts about that, and it's kind of hard to drill down, because I think we're talking about something that is very hard and very nuanced and very particular to different communities. And I think as we're talking about this, we should also think about the fact that a lot of the sort of identities and communities that we kind of see as existing as the communities that we put people in, right, are communities that folks have created themselves. They're communities that the majority has kind of put folks into, right? We talk about Asian Americans as a holistic group, but you know, there is such a wide spectrum of economics, of immigration status, of all of these things within the Asian American community, that it's really, really hard to put a single identifying factor, a single identity behind, because we're talking about a giant region of the world that we are combining into a small population in America that we are trying to ascribe ideas and characteristics to. But you look at my family. My family's been here since about the 1800s. I'm fourth generation American. But I still get asked all the time, like, where I'm from or where my parents are from, what language I speak. But like, my family actually lost Japanese with my grandfather when he died, because they were in internment camps, and the effect of internment on Japanese Americans that are still here is that there's a real loss of culture. There's a real push towards assimilation, and there's a real push to like really fitting in, Americanizing names, not teaching your children English, all of these things, because this thing this very traumatic experience that happened to this giant community within our hundreds of thousands of people in America, and so that makes the Japanese American community within the Asian American community very different. And so I think we need to be careful when we ascribe things, and you look at trans women of color have very different fights than white cis gay men. Very different life experiences, very different fights, very different needs from public policy. And so, the fact that we're all sort of grouped together by sort of outside folks, essentially, there's a lot of tension within our community because of that. So I think we need to really think about how identities get formed before we have a conversation about what those identity groups then do.
I guess what I'm wondering though, and you gave a really good answer, is can you be a really focused identity person and at the same time be a really focused person who wants to push assimilation and acculturation? Do the two things work together, or are they antagonistic? Lenny, you have an answer?
Antagonistic. I mean, it's antagonistic because the majority culture generally in America has always said you have to look and act like us, or else you're not going to be accepted as an American. You ask the question, who's an American? I can tell you who an American is. To America, an American is somebody that's blonde, male, looks a certain way, comes from Heartland, USA, or even looks a certain way. They come from Philadelphia, they look a certain way. They come from New York, they look a certain way. The browner you get, the image and the definition of American changes. Would people call Michael Jordan American? No, they would call him an African American. So when those practice identity politics embraces that reality of how African Americans and those that are part of that designation are treated, whether it's African American or people of color or Latino American or whatever else, then there's that rub. At the same time though, America's supposed to be the melting pot. That was one of the things that was supposed to make us great. One of the things about American culture is it doesn't just stay the same. 100 years ago, jazz didn't really exist. It was coming into formation. I mean, you all don't remember when hip hop didn't exist. I do, which kind of ages me too. But that's something that influenced the world and is seen as American. One of the different things about American culture is the fact that it's always this blend of everything. Heck, Taco Bell. Taco Bell didn't exist the way it does now 50 years ago. Now there's a Taco Bell in Montana, where there's also the Klan and white supremacists, but they're going to a Taco Bell to have their meetings at night. So,
And having bagels on the weekend.
bingo, and having bagels on the weekends. So that shows you that you can do both. The difference is there are some people from a certain class, if you look a certain way, you have the opportunity to blend in faster. That implicit bias that people have against many people of color in America or people that are different in America doesn't kick in as fast. It gives you a chance to know the individual, and then you can actually actively turn off that implicit bias where the darker you are, the more different you look, it kicks in faster and it's harder to get over for many Americans.
So just a comment and maybe a response from our panelists. There was a film that came out, I guess, in the 1980s called Do the Right Thing, Spike Lee. Anyone in here ever see it? Yeah. Okay. So there was a scene in which Spike Lee was working in a pizza parlor, and there was an Italian young man who was basically a racist and didn't even really give it a moment's thought. And Spike Lee was trying to confront him and said something like, well, what about Michael Jordan? And the young Italian man said, Michael Jordan's not black. He's a basketball player. Okay? So maybe our society has different ways in which it segments people of certain attributes like musicians, entertainers, wealthy, versus underprivileged or under wealth people. Okay? What do you think about that? How does that fit into this identity? You notice that Michael Jordan's not really out on the mainstream of promoting social justice issues, nor is Tiger Woods.
So I think a couple different things, right? Like everyone knows exceptions, and so like Obama is an acceptable black person, right? And so for a mass majority, and I think that Michael Jordan and athletes, and there's a whole conversation around just like the objectification of like bodies of color that I think is a totally different conversation, and like how capitalism like intersects. But I think that what we really need to sit with is that there's always certain people based on class, based on access, based on certain educational identity markers that make people acceptable. And so, for example, I went to Bryn Mawr College and I'm now at Penn, right? So to some degree, I became more acceptable. And so I work in corporate America and can access certain rooms and spaces because of that. But I also understand that some of my family members who come from the same family that didn't necessarily have the same trajectory as me, people would treat them very differently. And so I think that there's always been, like, there was OJ, right? At one point he was still, like, what happened with his case. And so athletes, musicians, those are people that are acceptable. But where I think we need to look past is like the everyday person you interact with is not Michael Jordan, won't be OJ, won't be Beyonce. And so I think that part of this conversation around like where you see Michael Jordan show up, and so I think he just like had an announcement where he opened up a lot of like health centers within his community. And so I think people's activism look differently. And so when we talk about disparity, and so to me, I look at that as acting within his community that's underserved, and he used his access and privilege to translate and give back. So I'm someone, I have protested in the street, but I understand that. And then I've also had conversations with police commissioners and elected officials, right? I believe that the idea of activism is a wide spectrum. It does not always look the same, but sometimes don't necessarily, and I think it's kind of like identity politics, like people have broad brushes of like, what does activism really look like? Probably is a form of activism that I'm using my resources as a black man from a capitalistic society to now go back and serve my underserved community that's disadvantaged, that's predominantly of color. So I would just push back a little bit that I wouldn't necessarily say it's not activism. He may say that it's not, but in a way it is.
I would just, as a comment, say that it took Michael Jordan 25 years to be socially engaged. I mean, not that there's never a point at which you shouldn't do it, but he certainly didn't step up to it.
I would also point out that Colin Kaepernick still doesn't play for an NFL team. Like, there is not like talk about, you know, certain people will have like can reach an achievement to be more acceptable in sort of white society, right? But there's still what we consider acceptable behavior once you're sort of let into the club, right? Like, so you still don't have the freedom. Just because you're there doesn't mean that you have the freedom to actually do what you want. So like, I would push back. I don't think we know the sort of pressures he was under from sponsors, from his team, from the NBA, from who not be socially active. Maybe he did have something that he wanted to do, and they made it very clear to him that there were nothing to be tolerated. He is still a slave to them.
That was just never even the slightest whimper.
Yeah, but that's a choice too. I mean, did he identify as an African American that was an NBA champion and the most marketable person on the face of the earth at the time of the Rodney King riots, by himself as somebody who was trying to build a brand with Nike, the Chicago Bulls. Muhammad Ali in boxing was so much more than boxing is now 50 years ago. Nick still was not working for the NFL team. There are people that have put stuff on the line, you know, and I think that's one interesting thing of where we are with identity politics today. I mean, if you go back to Muhammad Ali, when he took the stance he took, NBA stars, NFL baseball stars, not only did they side with him, but they did other things as well. Kurt Flood. There's a reason why there's so much money, big money in baseball these days, is because of what that ended up sacrificing his career in order to push that about. There were people that chanced in that people are not willing to pretend something that Ann said. People forget that when President Obama, after the 2010 midterm election, signed the that President Bush had in place and he extended them, the same called the Republicans a bunch of racists. Behind reports, and you probably saw some of them, Dr. Rosenberg, that in saying some of the same coded language about President Obama, that we're too young, this boy doesn't know, this boy, Colombian. But all of a sudden, this was the stuff that was 2010. And it's amazing that even though the 44th President of the United States, a lot of political capital when he came on, who had to go through that with his, well, remember, Harry Reid, you know, he didn't speak. He went to Harvard. But that's 44th President of the United States, African American.
Probably 20 for running for president. Only 9 to 11. And okay, there are in a president. Should be real, the term real politics. How
Most candidates you know, and making sure that we have this is I think it's and so I don't think necessarily like who fills tickets. It's probably needs, like, even though they're how you need to not
sometimes and you granted, I think some that again the more nuanced times in politics, like, to the table.
So I'll just interrupt for just 1 second. So that's an example, a good one. Booker, if he was put on the ticket in South Carolina, the ticket probably still wouldn't do very well because Cory Booker doesn't do that well in a state like South Carolina. And the old white guy, okay, Joe Biden, does really well. So there's this little bit of disconnect, not just what is your skin color or what is your gender, but how are you perceived by the voting audiences?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think it's sometimes given credit. I think that sometimes people get caught up in the identity politics. I think for them because they were black, and it's just like some people do. Like I voted for Obama because he's black, but other people actually that were black voted for him because they thought he was the better candidate, right? And so you have to have space for both of those, and not discount and diminish what people accomplish just because a certain community may vote for them or not. And it shouldn't just be the automatic assumption that that will happen.
Okay. Lonnie, you want to make a comment?
It's just interesting because it's still identity politics whether or not what they look like. I mean, 2016 and people not voting for Hillary Clinton was about identity politics for African American voters. Because the woman just called African American kids 20 years ago, prior to that, super predators. Her husband was responsible for the mass incarceration of the 1990s and that crime bill. People didn't really say I was sorry. Then she didn't go to certain states, which just made it worse. So you have people either stay home, or Democrats voted for Jill Stein or Harambe, and then the people that were in the middle voted and polled the whole time saying, I'm going to vote for Clinton, I can't stand Trump, and then tacitly went in Pennsylvania, like for example, Western Pennsylvania, where I'm from, and they voted for Trump. So just because you think that, well, this ticket doesn't look like it reflects identity politics, A, doesn't mean that's the case, and B, when you look at it, still voting with their interests. Just the same, the poor white voter in Washington County, here in Pennsylvania, in rural parts of Ohio, in rural parts of Michigan, because they do exist, who do you think those folks were voting for? Generally speaking, they vote Democrat. They went with identity politics, and they didn't identify with Hillary Clinton, who was seen as being elitist and rich, and some would even say had some questionable character issues. They voted a different way. So it's not necessarily how you look sometimes. It still goes back to, based on my identity, will your policies be, even if it's that one or two big ticket items?
Okay, so let me just add one more thing, and then I think we're going to have to take some questions from the audience. My reading on the election is that the Democratic Party is being pulled heavily by the political left that often embraces the specific subgroups of liberal identity politics. And Ann made a point just a moment ago about how this is what Democrats want to have as their candidate, okay? That the Democratic Party is about getting the Democrat. And my question to all of you is that what it's really about, or is it about winning the White House with a candidate to maximize what the range of Democrats want? Okay, so in other words, in the Twitter world, okay, it's very, very liberal and very left-leaning, okay? Group that's more in the moderate or centrist group isn't really getting picked up there. So should there be more of an embrace of the broader population, or should people go about pushing their own group's interests?
So, I guess my question is, are you a population, or are you asking about the spectrum of sort of typical voters, right? I think that actually the future of the Democratic Party lies in us expanding the electorate to folks who have been disenfranchised or haven't seen themselves in politics, or like the majority of our country doesn't vote. Like, we have a whole lot of space where we can, like, we don't have to fight over, no offense to Western Pennsylvania, but we don't have to fight over Western Pennsylvania Trump voters that don't really like our candidates or our policies. But there are folks that do like our candidates and our policies, and who mostly just don't get out to vote for us. And so, you know, I think that this is a real tension within the Democratic Party, and I think right now, and I think you'll see folks on both sides of it, right? But I do think that at the end of the day, it's about expanding the electorate. It's about talking to more people, bringing more people into the process, and the way that we bring more people into the process is making it look like a place for everyone, right? So that we have folks that look like you in politics. You can see people that have life experiences that look like yours, that have families that might look like yours, that are more representative of the actual America that exists than the one that we kind of like, than the one that you see in Washington, right? Or in Harrisburg, or in most of our state capitals. So I think as we see more and more folks getting involved in politics, we see more women getting elected, we see more, we've seen a ton of historic firsts over the last few years, and so I think that's how we expand the electorate. I think we bring more people into the political process that way, and I think that that's where the future of the Democratic Party lies, personally, and so I don't have a problem with us going farther left, because I think that a lot of those policies speak to people who are, you know, why did Sanders catch fire in the way that he did, and bring more people into the process, because he was talking, I think, more realistically about a lot of things. I don't know, but I'm also pretty liberal, so.
Okay, so with that, let's take a couple of questions, and maybe you know, adjunct to some of the points that some people already made. So just tell us your name.
Hi, my name is Joe Lapria, Pennoni Panels student, and I'm a PPE major. I'm a sophomore. And thank you very much for this conversation. It was incredibly thank you. Thank you very much for the conversation. It was very insightful, and thank you very much for putting it on. My question to be politics is, well, firstly, it seems to me that of the three of you on the panel, nobody here has a problem with the actual practice of identity politics, just its use as a piece of vernacular, right? So the demonization of the word of identity politics, but the actual practice of doing it is not something that I don't believe anybody truly disagrees with. And also for this reason, I like to ask specifically, when we're talking about identity, we primarily are focusing our questions around group identities as opposed to the as an individual, and how that can transcend some of the, what I would think to be a little bit more arbitrary elements of our biological being, as opposed to the elements of our humanity that transcend, or you could say go deeper than that. And so I'd like to ask the board what you believe to be most important regarding somebody's individual identity and their ability for that individual element of their self as a politically salient element of their political views. So not just do I certain groups and do I represent or go with these groups, but rather how do I as an individual with my individual experiences go about and view the world?
Well, I think primarily what you would like to see from public policies is public policies that allow you to be able to make those individual choices on a regular basis without impediment necessarily.
I agree.
So from that perspective, if you take that approach, then there is an opportunity to fit into multiple different silos, or not necessarily silos because they're things, of identity politics that allow you to be that individual, yet see, okay, what policies allow me to be all 6 of these things at the same exact time? You know, that's where good politics and good public policy formation comes into play. I shouldn't have to pick one identity which only leads to one particular path of laws being passed. It should ideally be able to say, I could be a Catholic, I could be black, I could be conservative, I could be from Pittsburgh, but I can also relate to other Americans' experiences, and there are going to be some common sense wins that we can find from a policy standpoint that will allow us to all flourish as individuals. That's got to be the goal. If you don't do that, you're locked in.
If I may, do you believe that some of the emphasis on people's individual identities and their formation into these groups can emphasize, at least to them, or the rhetoric at least can emphasize to their being that this group identity is something which is probably more salient than my own experience, no matter where I'm coming from, considering the fact that not all people inside of a group have the same experiences?
Yes, especially considering the fact that you guys are going to reinforce the perspective that you're looking for. You have a 24-hour news cycle that's going to reinforce it, and we are more siloed as a society, but that's up to the individual not to buy into that trap. And we have to still trust the individual to make good choices in America. That's the whole premise of how we live our society.
Okay.
So just as an aside, in political science, there's a word or a concept called countervailing power. We have cross pressures, so the person could be female, could be gay, and could be a Latino. And maybe those different perspectives may view some of those issues in a different way. But that serves as a binding of a society, because within the same person they have these different strains. And I think what I was pointing out was that we also live in a very polarized society. And if you become a single issue politics person, you're going to be not focusing so much on those cross pressures and thinking about your narrow. And when that happens, we become even more and more polarized, select media that reinforces it, and now with social media being able to target down to the individual level, we get it in a formula that's going to make it really difficult for the society to come together. So just as a comment there. Any other questions? Yes, over here.
Is Lataj Carter. Now earlier it was mentioned Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign for, and I wanted to note that if anyone ever noticed, some of the highlights of her presidential campaign was that she appealed to celebrities, rappers, and she also not only did this to mainly minorities, specifically African Americans, but she also, as was said earlier, chose only to visit specific states instead of usually touring the whole of the United States. And in relation to identity politics, I wanted to ask that the idea of campaigning, at least if not for just a while candidate, do y'all believe that campaigning is becoming more of a marketish? The campaigns are not based on political ideology, also focused on specific factors such as race and wealth.
So I think you're right in that I think political ideology is not maybe, and like public policies like that are not necessarily the core of presidential campaigns. As somebody that runs campaigns professionally, I think a lot of campaigns are trying to do, whether or not they do it well, but I think what they're trying to do is, so most are not super well informed, right? They're not walking in and being, I know all of this candidate's proposed like policies and all of these things, and like I've like lined up the two, this one is closer to where I'm at. Like most, they actually vote in a way that's like somebody, and they're looking for sort of a gut. They're looking for, we talk about it all the time, and it drives me nuts, but it's that like, but what they're really looking for when we talk things, it does voter feel like understand and put themselves is essentially what candidates tend to do is they're trying to show folks that they understand people, they understand voters, and sometimes it ends, if it's really executed, it's pandering and it's negative things that we see about but if it's well actually under, but it's
you have to be holistic when you are limited with when you get and strategic definitely but it can become isolating, and then even that
And the you know what we're really talking about evolution. Primary elections that were real. Statistics or a narrow range. Their image to us. The mobile line, Facebook ads.
Hi, I'm Tommy. And almost it's the I to be kind of
overwhelming. Governor right now connect with voters by talking about plans and policies. Every candidate takes a different path on that, and a path that feels authentic to them and their story. This is how all Democrats are gonna run campaigns. Like, that's, first of all, not gonna work for the Democratic Party because we are whatever we're the candidate, like candidates, like voters can tell when candidates are inauthentic. Candidate to go with.
Just as a response to the last question, you know, over the last 30 years, political advertising has sort of changed. The first real political ads were done during the Eisenhower administration, but they were sort of novice type ads. But if you go to, for example, Bill Clinton, where he made these films about his youth and going to Korea State and going and shaking hands of President Kennedy, that same model, the same script was copied by Barack Obama. Even the music was the same for Obama's campaign as Bill Clinton's. And what happens is that candidates are really trying to present themselves in a way that they think is going to be appealing to the public. And you know, there's this notion on the other side that you know many candidates run on this patriotic, I'm a vet, I've done all this and I want to serve you. That's a very appealing sort of picture for a lot of Americans as well. So I think, as Ann was saying, each candidate has to choose how they want to present themselves. You know, Elizabeth Warren takes the perspective, I have a plan for that, and she can stand up there, and she's got, and that's probably why bi-coastal intellectuals like her so much, but the rest of the country doesn't bite the apple in the same way. So,
well, I mean, I would disagree with that based on the Iowa polling we're seeing, first of all.
well, Iowa, you know, we could go, this could be a long conversation, but Iowa is not really representative of the Democratic Party. So I think you have to think about what the Democratic Party is and who's actually going to vote in the election in the fall, not just who's going to be an early political activist and participant in Iowa. I think they're not necessarily the same thing. So,
that's fair, but you know, I would also say that Elizabeth Warren's strength with those policy proposals, not a bunch of policy proposals, it's that they are deeply researched and actually address the issues that they're trying to address. If you're somebody that's an activist or an advocate around an issue that she's got a policy on, most likely her plan is actually the gold standard for what you're trying to do. Like, and that's really what her strength is because she is policy wonk. She does know these things. She's been doing this for a while. Like, her diagnosing of problems and presenting of solutions is really being received by a lot of people that do this work, like that have been doing work in these areas for a long time as like, wow, yeah, no, this is the answer. This is what we've been trying to say.
So we're not disagreeing on people that are interested in knowing more and being an activist. Like, I'm talking about the Joe Q or Jane Q public policy plan.
Yeah, because part of what they're asking too is, do I want her to be commander-in-chief if we have to go to war? I mean, Newt Gingrich was the smartest man on the stage in 2012 by far. He had plans for everything. Then he went to Florida and started talking about colonizing the moon. He had a plan for that too, and his candidacy went like that. People don't want their presidents to just be ministers. They want their, and add to your analogy, they want one or two type of candidates. A candidate they can have a beer with, or a candidate that their kids could look up to be like as far as being a leader as well as implementer of plans. And she's checking off a lot of the former boxes, but not necessarily the other
So
ones.
I would say, Lenny, that she is actually now trying to check the other box.
Yes.
Because one of her big ad campaigns is you can enter into a raffle and you can go out and have a beer with me or a cup of coffee. Okay, so that's what. So she's recognized that that's an issue as well, and she wants to be kind of a person that people can imagine could sit down and have a beer with, and not make it alcoholic if they don't want. Okay, questions? Yes. Yep.
Good evening. My name is Steven Abraham. I'm a junior and I study computer animation. So my first take actually, it's a fantastic panel that we've had, and Dr. Rosenberg, thank you for moderating the entire session. You said that, and I don't know if I might be rephrasing this wrongly, if I am, but you said that essentially in certain communities where we know they specifically, vote in a way, for example, let's say Republican, and if you're Democratic, we don't necessarily need to reach out to them because they may not, respond back with the way. Isn't that kind of isolating them per se? Because if, at least in my even if someone is disagreeing with me, or I know someone is voting against my interest, I still believe their citizens must reach out to them. I mean, part of what I understand is, and I'm an observer here, because the context is I'm an international student, so I don't even have a leg in this race in the first place. Interestingly, I'm a junior, and so next year I'll be a senior, and 2020, God knows what's going to happen to my status and whatever is going to happen after that. But I come from India, where identity politics has fractured, and it's not necessarily on identity politics of race, but it's of religion and caste. And it's fractured the society horribly. And it's been the case so since 100 years. Yeah, we're all Indian, but no one has a common identity. And even if we try to put up our own identities, we tend to isolate each other. And well, essentially it's creating the fragmentation of the society then. So I think the question that I have for not just you, Anne, but for everyone on the panel is, we are going to head into the 2020 season where it's going to be perhaps one of the elections to come, right? We've had a tumultuous 4 years with Mr. Trump in the office, and we hopefully want to see someone who's got a much more centrist, or at least someone who's got a broader perspective of the entire country. What is your take on how the role of identity politics, if it needs to be changed for the 2020 elections, and how can we, as young people, contribute to that change of identity politics in society? Sorry about the long question.
No. And for the record, I would never say you just shouldn't talk to Republicans. I do say that if you're on a campaign, you have limited time, and you should talk to people that you can convince to vote for you. But for so I don't think any good elected officials half of their constituents in any way, shape, or form. Just want to make that clear. But I think actually, so the way we talk about identity politics is that we talk about it as this divisive thing, which is why I don't like it, right? It is a way to separate out groups. But what it can be is an acknowledgement that we need more groups at the table. We need more folks at the table. We need more people that are different to have a voice in our government. So what are we doing to make sure that that's the case? So it's not, so I think it can actually be, if we do this right, and if we're cognizant of it, and we're looking to bring a diversity of opinion and background and experience to the table that's making decisions, we are going to be, I think, more likely to create a society that is more inclusive and does work for more people and does not kind of break and fracture. Because I think that we are, it's a terrible phrasing words, but I think we're stronger together. I think we're stronger as a group. We are a better society when we're a society that's working for all people, right? We're making sure that all people have what they need to live, work, and feed their families, put a roof over their heads, and do the basics that they need to live in it, and get an education. Let's figure out how to do those basics for everyone.
This is going to get me in trouble both on the panel and as a Republican. But I would say one of the things that young people can do is actually embrace in the very best of what it is, and don't be afraid of that. One of the reasons why identity politics exists is so that people are not invisible in American society. It is a way to say, I too am an American, I too belong. And I think that in embracing that, in order to heal what you were going towards, is you gotta have, most politicians don't have political skill anymore. They know how to smile on camera, they can read a teleprompter, they know how to talk to their base and get them fired up. That's not political skill. What we want to start pushing for politicians that actually have true political skill and leadership ability. Because that's when people can be comfortable in their subsets, be comfortable in who they are, their identity as individuals or within a set of groups, and you can still tell them, my policy on this tax reform will help you send your kids to college for the first time ever in your family, etc. But that takes skill, and that takes communication skill. I mean, Bill Clinton was very good at that. Barack Obama was very good at that. And then you got other examples. We won't mention current, occupants of the White House. But that's what it really boils down to. Unfortunately, as a constituency, push for that anymore. It's like, you're an R, you're evil. You're a D, you're evil. You want to destroy the country, no, you want to destroy the country. And so we're trying to vote against people that are trying to destroy the country rather than trying to vote for people that know how to actually build the country up.
So this and then we'll take this. This is one of the reasons why I don't like our political system. Being a two-party system is a bad thing. Okay? Because what happens is you're in war. You can fight within your own party, but there's two choices. When you go into a parliamentary party, so you could identify with a party more like you do, you have representation in the room, and then you work on that representation to build coalitions. So in a lot of ways, our founding fathers are this whole of
along the lines of what we were saying, do you think that the candidates, the Democratic candidates, are thinking about how to bring voters for Trump, and who are not Democratic? I see perhaps, I'm not sure, Buttigieg, the more moderate in what I think. And I'm wondering whether the real can be about the fact that there's this whole.
I think there's a couple different ones and share the capital. He said any good leader wants their or everyone has to be able to. I think this close is as leaders, and that's from the local council people. And so I think where our position is that we focus a lot on the presidential egregious stuff that people will put in our own place, but we are not really engaging in the correct conversation. So what you can do, I think, when you're in like this and you do have people with opposing views, they can be uncomfortable and engage with a conversation. You make a vote, they need all of our votes in theory. So when they come into your communities, have a certain issue you care about, or just in generally ask them to end instead of checking the box. If you're great, or if you different things like that. Those things are great, and it's great. Again, they do have a job to do, and we can do is not ready. To engage what their particular strategies, if they are can that work to do. I think it's interesting. Blamed in the left just because of how expectations for people.
That's what there's a divide in the demographics. Like towards the down, okay, in all of the elections. And large
current Democratic candidate. Closure. Right.
November,
You're right.
they're actually in right now.
series today.